on the green line, that'll be the Civil War deaths. The killings that take place in the white, that's under the jurisdiction of the FAR. The killings that take place within the green, that takes place within the jurisdiction of the RPF. Now, the territorial control argument basically suggests that the killings in the white are plausibly genocide, politicide, or random. Civil wars on the line, back here, reprisal killing, or random. Whoa. Saw that one. Sorry. Okay. One zone, second zone, third zone. So what this animation does is it overlays the same exact killing information that you saw before. Was there any reported killing at all? And it's overlaid with the animation of the troop movements so you can get some general sense of command responsibility. So all this is creating is zones of control and possible clarification or categorizations of different types of violence that are taking place. Now, what you'll find interesting is, one, the RPF take over a lot of territory very quickly. They also hold distinct positions at different points in time for long periods of time. This generally is corroborated with a bunch of information provided by Dallaire and others on the ground about comparative kind of troop capabilities. Generally, it was assumed that the RPF could have taken the whole country at any point in time, and that the FAR were not that capable of actually engaging in civil war. Evidently, they seem more than capable of engaging in genocide and politicide, and thus we see that. What's also important is this is the French that come in towards the end. You also have killings that take place there. Now, I'm not saying that the French are killing them. I'm just not ruling it out. To figure out exactly the circumstances under which those people are dying, or any of the people that are in any of the zones, you need to get down to the level of the event. But the objective is to identify whether or not there's any understanding of what we can derive of what took place from moving these zones around and thinking of who's being killed where. And so now we get to these issues of perpetrators. Who's responsible for killing? So I then take the information that are derived from the previous animations and then go from that to kind of command responsibility. Genocide is, as I suggested before, undertaken by governments and their affiliates. So genocidal activity that in front of the front involves them as being held responsible. The FAR government and their affiliates. Politicide, same deal. Civil war, the deaths are attributed to the FAR or to the rebels. Reprisal killings, that's attributable to the rebels. Random you could have random from the government, random from the citizenry, random from the rebels. This is how we need to start understanding it. So part of what the project is attempting to do is we get away from broad categorizations of this thing was just genocide, this thing was just civil war. The key is to figure out all of what is taking place in terms of the events and identify the systematic relationships, if any, that one could detect between the different forms of violence. This becomes important because, for example, war crimes as a conception involves a relationship between two different forms of killing and a relationship between two different types of actors. Genocide is presumed to be territorial under the control of the government. They engage in violent activity, but it ignores context. It ignores the fact that governments are pushing forward with their effort as they are engaged in some other controversy or conflict which could involve war crimes, for example, or an interstate or civil war. Now, when you're looking at the animation closely, which this is online, so you could look at it at your leisure, but what becomes interesting is the surges in the killing in front of the line follow surges and advancements of the RPF battlefront. So as the RPF pushes into the country, there's more violent activity that takes place in front of their line. Now, by conventional conceptions, the genocide is attributable to the government. That's who we blame. But the pace of the killing, we can lay at the foot of the RPF as they move in. Now, what's interesting is you start looking at trace evidence for like what the Clinton administration was hearing and so forth. Declassified documents show that there's all types of discussion to get the RPF to stop pushing into the country. They're not doing it. Their objective is to take over the country. But as an after effect of their continuing to push in, this then prompts killing in front of it. The reason for that I'm going to get to in a second. What becomes interesting, what becomes important for us to understand is whenever they stop, the killing in front of the battlefront stops and slows down. Whenever they push in, the killing in front of their battlefront increases. So how many people were involved in the killing? Remember, initially it was like, is it 100,000, is it 1 million? Well, what becomes interesting from much of the source material that we have, this includes two sources in particular, Human Rights Watch and Africa Rights. We're doing this with some other sources as well. What becomes interesting is there's a lot of perpetrators being identified at relatively low killings. High amounts of killings, obviously it's not 1 or 10 perpetrators that are killing all these people. These are people identified by battle unit, by name. There's very few people that are identified in this zone, and at the higher level killings, of which there are quite a few, there are very people identified here. And this makes sense. Large-scale killings where 30 or 40 or 11,000 people are getting killed completely, there's no one left to identify anybody. That information's gone. So people that are getting identified are generally kind of coming from the lower level killings. And this makes it extremely difficult to actually make any estimations about how many people were involved in killing from that trace evidence. You could argue that how do you kill 20,000 people? Then you get to battle death estimations and you get to battle capacity estimations of how many people does it take to kill 20,000 people. So then we get to this understanding of, okay, well, a lot of people talk about machetes and that involvement. Machetes were one way that people were killed. People were shot, things were blown up. You go to the discussions and trace evidence on how you kill 30,000 people, much of that is military hardware. That's how you kill 30,000 people. Smaller killings involve explosives, people being hatched, people being shot. The variation with the killing capability helps us piece back together the issue of what perpetrators are involved. Now, the victims, this is where much of the conversation has gone with regards to Rwanda. So first we'll address the issue of how many died. So this represents a schematic of considering the 5 sources that we believe to be the most useful. African Rights, an international human rights organization, the Minister of Education, Human Rights Watch, Ebuka, a Tutsi survivor organization, and the Ministry of Youth, Culture, and Sport. We also compare these estimates against the Minister of Local Affairs and so forth. So what this represents is when you use an individual source, what's the estimation that you get? And what's the range, the high and the low? So in these reports, occasionally, it's not just a point figure you're given for a death in a particular location at a particular time. They're like, well, it's between 100 and 500. So if you start taking the ranges that are reported, that gives you the top and the bottom part of the bar, and the dot represents our point estimation and estimations of the average. So if you take the individual sources, or combinations of 2, or combinations of 3, you'll notice you have these wide varying kind of estimations that then starts to pare down. So what we've done is we've only taken estimations that were in all 5. Very conservative estimation, but the one we feel most comfortable with. All source material identify at least a value, and then we go from there. So our estimation comes in principally there with a range. This is our median estimation. So the high end is 675,000, Low is about 310. 425 approximately is what we give as a medium range value. That's our medium range value, and that's the one we feel most comfortable with saying. But as I mentioned before, all the source material is available. If you believe that certain sources are better than others, the person is allowed to basically select what they wish. And this shows the distribution of values that you get. Well, now let's look at this animation again, except this time let's include information about the deaths at individual locales. So this will be the same animation that you've seen. The white is where no one was killed. Yellow goes from 10. High red is 75,000. This is a single day killing, can range from 10 to 75,000 in a commune. Now what becomes important to think about now is where lower level killings are taking place, when higher level killings are taking place. I tend to think of the ones that are between like 10 people and 100 in a particular location at a time. That doesn't take much technology. To kill 75,000 people in a day, that takes some weaponry. So now we're looking at military units. And so that's part of where we're trying to go, which is to try to identify these different thresholds and relate that to information about troop movements to get some better fix on who's responsible for what. The number of killings broken down by zone, so this is under the jurisdiction of the FAR, clearly the most. The zone of the RPF that's behind the area, the RPF FAR front, the French zone, the French RPF front, which comes later. Now clearly, the bulk of the individuals killed fall under the territorial jurisdiction of the FAR. That clearly supports a conception of most of the deaths are attributed to genocide or politicide. Now, any that are familiar with the project know that in 2004 I got called the genocide denier. I don't deny genocide, it's right there. What I do though is I identify when people get killed, where they get killed, and what dynamics are responsible for or pushing that death. And I put that at the feet of the RPF. The spatial analysis we're doing now shows that, as I suggested before, the deaths, the surges in deaths, the surges in violent activity are calibrated to their advancements into the country. So when we think of who is responsible, as we think through the issue of how we think about causality, how we think about who is in need of being at least investigated or queried on the issue of what caused what, we need to consider the movement of these different battle zones, the relationship between them, and then think through that. In addition, this shows the number of absolute deaths by geographic location. This is not including the issue of animation. What becomes complex about studying Rwanda is many people pay attention to structural conditions. I think maybe structure mattered for about a week or 2 weeks before structure was completely irrelevant because you have to follow individuals as people were running through the country, both to kill and to flee being killed. So there's certain studies that were done that were trying to calibrate the killings as a function of the amount of prior political mobilization or the degree of openness within the government or presence of local military operations and so forth. That's just inappropriate given this particular context. So who died exactly? Well, there's estimations by Abuka, the Tutsi survival organization, that 300,000 Tutsi survived. How many people does that mean died? Okay, well that varies by a function of the total number. Now, we think the number that's most reasonable about how many were there beforehand was 506,000. I'll get to how we got to that in a second. But effectively, if 300,000 people survived, start with 506, 206,000 victims. Well, part of the importance of how many Tutsi were in the country in 1994 relates back to how many people left the country in 1959 and 1960, and how many people